Most people are in agreement about kind of what 2050 needs to look like, when we get to net zero, albeit obviously there are some disagreements over the direction of travel for, say, heating. But I think the big thing is, I like to think of it as a bit of like a mountain. So you've got a big mountain to climb. On top of that mountain, we know where we need to get to, but how do we bring people up? And at the top, you might have, say, a lifestyle that sort of involves maybe living car-free, flying much, much less than we do, maybe very little at all. Then a bit further down that mountain, you've got things like perhaps switching to a battery electric vehicle. A bit further down, maybe insulating your home, switching to low carbon heating. Further down again, you've maybe got things like turning down the temperature on your thermostat, maybe mending clothes rather than buying new, recycling. Most people are at the bottom of that mountain, right? A lot of people recycle. UK has a big recycling rates as they do in other countries. And the challenge is that although most people are at the bottom, we do also have people who've already started to make their way towards the top. And the big challenge is that we've got everyone starting that journey from a very different starting point. And it's about how do you manage to communicate with all those audiences at the same time without alienating people. And in particular, where we're particularly focusing on talking about, say, heat pumps, electric vehicles, as a lot of us in the room will be, that we don't get accused of being elitist and basically not being very inclusive about the way we try to bring people to a net zero world. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we're going to have to deal with. And there are kind of two main approaches that we can take to this, I'd say. The first is that we just focus on those early adopters. We say, well, look, the cost of these technologies will decline over time, and that will mean the majority of people then do start to become part of that audience that we can be speaking to. The big advantage of that is, of course, that you get your biggest bang for your buck. You're focusing on the actions that will deliver the kind of biggest return on investment in terms of saving carbon emissions. The downside, of course, is that you risk alienating people. And also what happens is that if people don't feel involved in the conversation from the start, they've switched off before you get to the point where they can start affording those technologies. The alternative is you have a more tailored conversation with people. So you actually talk to those who are early adopters at the same time as encouraging those who, whilst they might not be able to buy a heat pump or insulate their home, they can be recycling. They can start thinking about, can they switch one of their journeys that they might take in a car to a bike? And by doing that, you bring them along that journey so that they don't feel excluded, so that when the time comes that these technologies are more accessible to everybody, they feel part of that conversation and involved. So I think the big challenge is how we be inclusive.
And we were talking a little bit, we were preparing for this panel about, the knowledge gap, or frankly the financing gap, which maybe we'll talk about. How do I change my heating system in my house? And how do I finance that? And the elitism argument is interesting because, of course, we can watch adverts for electric vehicles, which is felt that it's, a certain section of society that might be able to make that choice. But maybe there is a focus on those, those smaller steps. And you spoke very interestingly about that knowledge gap and obviously the advice that you give to UK government departments as well. And maybe you could just talk a little bit more about how you bridge those gaps to get people along.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, as a behavioural scientist, we kind of use sort of very standard tools to try and break down what are the barriers to behaviour change. And one of the big ones is obviously opportunity barriers, so the price, the cost of things, say the fact that, say, hydrogen boilers don't exist yet commercially. The other one being capability. Do I have the skills, the knowledge, the expertise? Do I feel confident that if I want to change my light bulb, I know how to do it? That if I want to install insulation, I know what type of walls I have. Are they solid or are they cavity? And am I motivated? And so we say, well, okay, we've talked about price already, so let's talk about knowledge. I think one of the biggest challenges of knowledge is that for some people they are very energy literate, but there's also lots of people who don't necessarily distinguish between what's gas in their home and what's electricity. And that's really, really problematic when it comes to the fact that we're talking about energy, the fact that energy, in a sense, using it is bad, right? It generates carbon emissions. But of course, electricity is our renewable source of energy. But people don't necessarily know that, why is an electric vehicle better for the environment? If you don't necessarily know that it's because the electricity can be generated not just with coal, not just with gas, but also with wind, they don't realise that's why electric vehicles are better. And as a result, they don't necessarily know, for example, why gas heating is one of their biggest kind of contributors to their emissions in their homes. And therefore, when it comes to government policies that, say, subsidise the cost of alternative technologies, they don't necessarily see why it's their gas boiler that they might want to focus on removing from their homes. So I think one of the big knowledge gaps is just basically distinguishing between gas on the one hand and electricity on the other. The other big knowledge barrier is, I think, this general feeling that is held amongst people, which is that they don't really feel like they know enough about what actions government and other countries are taking to mitigate climate change. People have a general sense, right, that this is a big problem to solve. It cannot be solved alone. You can't solve it as an individual. And therefore, if you don't realise what steps government, businesses, other countries are taking to mitigate climate change, you won't feel like your actions are going to be sufficient, and therefore you won't be motivated to do it. So I think one of the big lessons and one of the things we say is that we need to increase sort of operational transparency. Government, businesses around the world are doing a lot to try to mitigate climate change and changing their supply chains, but those things aren't necessarily that visible to the public. And if it's not visible, people won't see that those contributions are being made, and therefore that the role that they play is therefore worthwhile because they're a part of a whole.